Hello, everybody. Um, last week we were talking about holiness. I'm sorry it was a bit rushed. The basic idea I wanted to convey was a slightly different understanding of holiness than what maybe standard. We standardly think of holiness, I think, in the Jewish tradition as a type of separateness. And in fact, the word kadosh literally can mean separated. But I wanted to suggest, and actually more even than the Midrashim, taking my lead from a verse in the book of Ziering, where God says that what separates the land of Israel out from other lands is that God's eyes are on it from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. And I took this notion that perhaps what it really means to be holy is to be standing in somebody's gaze in a certain way, in the way Howard Wetstein said, that anything that you hold in awe, anything that you look at as an object of awe is for you in that moment, subjectively holy. And then I saw that Dafka, specifically, actually, when you look in the various Midrashim about holiness, it does seem as if, and this is what Rashi, I think, is getting at, and his source material, when he says that the key to holiness is to, so to speak, run away from, to distance oneself from sins of a sexual nature. It seems that some of his source material is particularly interested in that sort of gaze, the male gaze perhaps, which objectifies a woman, and in so doing holds the person in the wrong sort of gaze. When you hold things in the right sort of gaze, they become holy. Even things which we sanctify in Jewish law, like a goat, a random goat that you turn into a korban, by making it a korban, a sacrifice, a specific type of legal status falls upon it. And in the midst of that change of status, it's as if the goat moves from the background to center stage, so to speak, in God's gaze, because the halakha is special to God. So it was this kind of notion of kedusha, of holiness, that we were working on last week. This week, in Parshat Omer, I want to look at two types of midrash. One's a more halachic type of midrash, which we haven't really looked at so far. And the halachic midrash is when the rabbis use details in the verse to understand the halakha, to understand, practical, how are we supposed to act. And the other type of midrash I want to look at is a classic midrashic form, which is the mashal. And a mashal means something like a parable, an analogy, a metaphor, an allegory. It's some sort of literary form that covers that sort of ground, all of the above. So we're going to look at both of those, and we're going to look at them, these two forms of midrash, in the context of something that comes up in this week's Parsha, which is the festival of Sukkot. Now, in terms of the narrative of Vayikra, because I certainly wanted to keep that going, we've been talking about the narrative arc of Vayikra. We've had the purity code, we had this code about holiness with all of these various different laws. And I was trying to make sense of that last week, and perhaps part of what the message of last week's Parsha was, is that all of those various different aspects of our life, the ethical, the ritual, the business, they can all become part of a holy life if you, so to speak, look at them in the right way, if you treat them in the right way. But this week's Parsha looks at the notion of holy time. So we're still in the notion, we're still within the holiness code. And when we deal with holy time, we're talking about the festivals, and one of those festivals is Sukkot. So without further ado, let me share with you my PowerPoint screen. We're going to be talking about Karl Marx and Midrash. As you'll see towards the end, I think there are things that Karl Marx has to say that might help us understand better the overarching theme that the two midrashic forms we're going to be looking at today share. But before we look at Parshat Omer, let me share with you a quote from the book of Devarim, Sefer Devarim. It's relevant because of the ways that the rabbis bring this verse into conversation with verses in our Parsha, Parshat Omer. So the verse in Deuteronomy 16 says, Chag HaSukkot taseh lecha, you should make for yourself the festival of Sukkot, Shivat Yamim, for 7 days, V'aspecha migarnecha mikvecha. At the time of the harvest from the threshing room floor, the harvest from the vineyard, from the vat, the wine vat. This verse comes up in Masechet Sukkot, in Tractate Sukkah. You're gonna have access to this this PowerPoint. So if you want to look at inside the original Hebrew, we can. We'll just look at the English together to save time. Rabbi Eliezer says, don't go from sukkah to sukkah, and don't make a sukkah in the intermediate days. So he makes it sound like really you should have one sukkah for the whole Chag. And if you didn't build one before the festival, it's too late. And the sages, they disagree with Rabbi Eliezer, and just for your knowledge, we don't, the halacha here doesn't follow Rabbi Eliezer. The halacha follows the majority of his peers, the sages, who say, no, you can go from sukkah to sukkah, and you can make a sukkah on the intermediate days. The intermediate days are the days between the first day of Sukkot and Shmini Atzeret, the 8th day. But they agree, Rabbi Eliezer and the sages agree, that if your sukkah falls down, let's say on the first day it's very windy, then you can return and rebuild it during the intermediate days. And the basic idea there is even Rabbi Eliezer accepts that's not really a new sukkah. It's rebuilding rather than building, and that's okay, Rabbi Eliezer says. Okay. Then the Gemara asks, and this is where we get into this notion of halachic Midrash. The Gemara asks, yeah, but where does Rabbi Eliezer get that from? And indeed, where do the sages get that from? And it comes from a close reading of the verse. What's the reason for Rabbi Eliezer? Well, scripture says, make for yourself the festival of Sukkot for 7 days. So it's this phrase in the Pasuk for 7 days, meaning the sukkah has to last for 7 days. It says, make for yourself a sukkah for 7 days. So it needs to last for 7 days. So if you didn't build it ready for 7 days, it's too late, right? Make for yourself the festival of Sukkot for 7 days, i.e. make a sukkah that's suitable for 7 days. Well, what do the sages do with that? You know, the sages have to explain what that verse means differently. And they said, no, this is what the Merciful One says. You can make a sukkah during all the 7 days of the festival, right? During any of the 7 days, you can make a sukkah. So, okay, so you've seen a type of halachic midrash. We're gonna do some more in a moment, but I also want you to remember, because we're not going to come back to this verse in Devarim 16. I want you to remember a different phrase, which is ta'aseh lecha, make for yourself. That phrase is also going to be relevant when we look at our Parsha, Parshat Omer. Okay, so in Parshat Omer, chapter 23, we have this much longer discussion of the festival of Sukkot. And you shall make for yourself on the first day, you shall take for yourself on the first day of the festival, the lulav and etrog, the 4 species, right, which we know to be the lulav, the etrog, the myrtle leaf, and the willow. And you shall rejoice before the Lord your God for 7 days, and you shall celebrate it as a feast for the Lord 7 days in the year. It's an eternal statute for the generations. You shall celebrate it in the 7th month, Tishrei. You shall dwell in booths for the 7 days of this festival. Every citizen of Israel shall dwell in booths, in order that future generations will know that I made the Israelite people live in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt, I, the Lord, your God. Now, what I want you to take from this verse, from these verses, the things that the key phrases I want you to remember, because these are the phrases the rabbis are going to play with in their halachic drashot, is take for yourself, again, just like we saw in Deuteronomy, you are to make for yourself a sukkah. In Parshat Omer, you're told to take for yourself the arba minim, the 4 species. And also I want you to remember this phrase, kol ezrach Yisrael, every citizen of Israel. That phrase is also going to be important. We find in Tractate Sukkot Sukkah, sorry, in the tractate of the Babylonian Talmud that deals with Sukkah. The same rabbis, Rabbi Eliezer and his peers, the Chachamim, the sages, nameless sages. This is a Breita, which is a text from the time of the Mishnah that the Gemara quotes. A Breita. Rabbi Eliezer says, just as a person cannot fulfill his obligation on the first day of the festival with the lulav of his friend, as it's written, and you shall take for yourself, right? Our Parsha, I asked you to remember, take for yourself. Rabbi Eliezer wants to learn from that which is yours. The lulav has to belong to you. You can't even borrow it from a friend, let alone steal it, right? You can't even borrow it. It needs to be yours. Now, we actually do rule like that halachically. There are loopholes which instead of borrowing it from your friend can give it to you, very much on the understanding that you'll give it back afterwards. But at the point that you take the lulav and etrog, it needs to be yours. So too, says Rabbi Eliezer, a person cannot fulfill his obligation in the sukkah of his friend. As it's written, make for yourself the festival of Sukkot, i.e. from that which is yours. So just like the lulav needs to be yours, says Rabbi Eliezer, the sukkah needs to be yours. Now that would pose a problem for us on the festival of Sukkot, because we like to go and eat in our friend's sukkah, and we make a bracha when we do it, and we think we're doing a mitzvah. Rabbi Eliezer says, no, you can't be in your friend's sukkah over Sukkot. There's no mitzvah there. You're not doing the mitzvah of Sukkot. It needs to be your sukkah. Asel lacha, as it says in the book of Deuteronomy that we saw, 16:13. So make for yourself the festival of Sukkot, i.e. from that which is yours. The sukkah has to be yours, just like the lulav. But don't worry, the sages disagreed with Rabbi Eliezer. And they said, even though they agreed with him, and they said that a person can't fulfill his obligation on the first day with the lulav of his friend, a person can fulfill his obligation in the sukkah of his friend. Why? Because it's written, every citizen of Israel shall dwell in Sukkot, it should say, in Sukkot. And they have a beautiful drasha. This is a really nice halachic drash. The fact that it says every citizen of Israel teaches that the Hebrew here is better than the English translation that I threw together. Melamed, it teaches Shekol Yisrael ru'uyim l'shev b'sukkah achat. One way you could even translate that is like, it would be fitting, it would be appropriate if all of Israel could sit in one sukkah together. Wouldn't that be nice, right? A more literal translation is that, you know, every Israelite can sit in a sukkah, right? Every Israelite is worthy of sitting in a sukkah. But it seems to be that's what they're getting at, is like, oh, halavai, wouldn't that be great if we could all just sit in one sukkah? And they're learning that from the verse. So don't tell me that we're all supposed to sit in our separate sukkahs. No, the verse is kind of aspirational. It says, oh, how lovely that would be if we could all sit in one sukkah together. Very different to Rabbi Eliezer's notion, each family in their own sukkah. But the Gemara asks rightly, is there right to ask, well, what do the sages do with this phrase, for yourself, in the book of Deuteronomy? Right? If they agree that take for yourself means the lulav needs to belong to you, why doesn't aseh lecha, make for yourself, mean the sukkah needs to be yours? No, don't worry, he said. They need that phrase lecha. They need that phrase for yourself. They need it to exclude a stolen sukkah. But regarding a borrowed sukkah, it's written every citizen. So it's the phrase every citizen comes to modify make for yourself in the book of Deuteronomy. In the book of Deuteronomy, make for yourself does imply that the sukkah needs to belong to you. But the phrase every citizen comes to modify that in the book of Vayikra, in the Parshat Omer. It modifies it and it says, yeah, make for yourself or borrow, because of this notion that wouldn't it be nice if all of the Israelites could sit in one sukkah together. And Rabbi Eliezer, what does he do with this phrase, every citizen? Well, he needs it for his own purposes. He needs it to teach that a convert who converts midway through the festival of Sukkot, or a child who becomes bar or bat mitzvah during the interim, during Chol HaMoed of Sukkot, that they're included in the mitzvah of Sukkah. Because Rabbi Eliezer has this idea that really, unlike the sages, you're not allowed to build a sukkah in the interim days. So for him, he needs some other verse to teach you that there's one special case in which you are allowed to build a sukkah in the interim days, not just when it's fallen over, but if you are a convert who converted in the middle of Sukkot, or you came of age in the middle of Sukkot. Well, where do the rabbis get that from then? If Rabbi Eliezer gets it from Kol Ezrach, well, the rabbis don't need a verse for that. Because if you remember from our earlier slide, the rabbis understood the verse in Deuteronomy differently anyway. The rabbis never thought there was a prohibition on building a sukkah in the interim days. So of course a convert can do that in the interim days. Of course, a boy who just bar mitzvahed could do that in the interim days. They don't need a verse for that because they don't even see a prohibition there in the first place. Okay, very nice. So we've seen something of a halachic drash, right? Two opinions, the sages and the rabbis, reading various phrases in the verses slightly differently, and those slight differences correspond to different understandings of the actual mitzvot in practice. Now let's stick with the sages, because the sages is how the halakha actually goes, and this is what we've learned. A lulav cannot be stolen. A lulav cannot be borrowed. Because when it says lulav, it doesn't say kol ezrach, every citizen. So a lulav can't even be borrowed. A sukkah cannot be stolen, but according to the sages, a sukkah can be borrowed. You can sit in your friend's sukkah over Sukkot, and you get the mitzvah. Yofi, very nice. Incidentally, though, and before we move on to the real Midrash I wanted to share with you, the mashal, things are never so simple. So we say, you can't use a stolen sukkah. Even the sages agree you can't use a stolen sukkah. But what would a stolen sukkah look like? I want to give you 3 cases that for all the world look like a stolen sukkah, and none of them are, according to the consensus of the sages and the rabbis. I'll ask you to guess why not in a minute, okay? Case number 1. Simon is sitting in his own sukkah, built with his own raw materials, on his own land. In barges Reuven from the street. Reuven picks Simon up by the scruff of his neck and forcibly evicts Simon from his own sukkah. Reuben the squatter sits down and enjoys a meal in Simon's sukkah. And the question is, was he yotzei the mitzvah of sukkah? Is this a stolen sukkah? Is this... No one's going to say this is good behavior. Right? This is horrible behavior. But when Reuben sat down and says, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu tzivanu leisheit b'sukkah, he made a benediction on the mitzvah of sukkah. Did he get the mitzvah of sukkah? Yes, he did. He did. Why?
It doesn't have to be his sukkah. It definitely is not the nicest way to do it.
But how's that borrowing and not stealing? He threw Simon out without Simon's permission.
Oh, but he doesn't need Simon. It seems he doesn't even need Simon's permission to enter the sukkah. It's all Kol Ezra. Every citizen can come in. Good. So he doesn't need Simon's permission.
Doesn't need Simon's permission. That's nice. So you learn from Avram learns from Kol Ezrach that Simon actually didn't have the right to permit Reuben from coming in the first place, and Reuben hasn't perhaps behaved very nicely, but that's not a stolen sukkah. Okay. I'll give a slightly different explanation later, but not far off from that explanation. Here's another one. Reuben sneaks into Simon's garage in the dead of the night and steals all of the raw materials that Simon was going to build his sukkah from. Reuben takes those materials back to his house and builds a sukkah from that stolen property on his own land during the festival. Full stop. During the festival, Reuben sits down in his newly built sukkah and enjoys a meal. Is that a stolen sukkah? Remember, the rabbis say you're not allowed to sit in a stolen sukkah. Is that a stolen sukkah? Shoshana says, yes, surely that's a stolen sukkah. Okay, hold that thought, okay. Case number 3. Reuben has legally acquired all the materials he needs to build a sukkah. He didn't steal them, but he can't find a plot of land to build it on. He therefore trespasses onto Simon's land, and he builds his sukkah there against Simon's will. During the festival, Reuben sits down in his newly built sukkah, built on Simon's land without Simon's permission, and enjoys a meal. Is that a stolen sukkah? Does he get the mitzvah? People think about that one.
No.
You don't think it's a stolen sukkah? Why?
No. This is different. Okay. He has no permission to build anything on somebody else's land.
Yeah.
So I think that this one, I think Reuven cannot. This is a stolen sukkah. This is not permitted, I think.
Okay. I hear you. Well, let me tell you the surprising conclusion. The consensus of the sages over the years is that all 3 of these are kosher. Horrible behavior, but all 3 of these are kosher, and I need to explain why, okay? So in the first case, right, I forcibly evict the owner of the sukkah from his sukkah and then have my meal there. That's actually the subject of a debate between, again, Rabbi Eliezer and the sages in the Gemara. And Rabbi Eliezer says, come on, that's a stolen sukkah, guys. If ever there was a stolen sukkah, this is a stolen sukkah. You barged in without permission. You picked up the landlord. You threw the landlord out. You sit there as a squatter and you make your bracha. That's a stolen sukkah. And the sage says, no, it's not. And they bring this principle, karka eina nigzelet, which means land is not considered stolen. Now, what does that mean? Once an object is stolen, certain legal consequences fall upon that object. So let's say Kayla steals my car. Okay, I know Kayla, and I know she's I know to be wary of her kleptomania. So she
also knows that I don't have a driver's license.
She also doesn't have a driver's license. So good luck stealing my car. And I know that about you too, Kayla. So Kayla somehow manages to steal my car. It's somewhat of a mystery how she did it, but she did. From that point on, my car is stolen. That means I'm not allowed to sell it. One of the reasons I'm not allowed to sell it is even though it's mine, it's not currently in my reshut, it's stolen. One of the legal consequences of an item being stolen is all the while it's stolen, you're not allowed to sell it. Kayla also can't sell it because it doesn't belong to her. She has to give it back to me, but nobody can sell it at the moment, not until it's recovered. But that's not the case with land. If Kayla comes and squats in our home, she'd be very welcome anyway. But if she did, and we wanted to evict her, and we couldn't, she just forcibly plonks herself down, and I can still sell the land. I mean, I'd have to tell the people who are buying it, by the way, you've got a bit of an issue. You're going to have to do something about this Kayla who's there all the time. But you can sell it. Why? I don't know why exactly. I'll give you a theory in a minute, but the idea is Jewish law doesn't treat stolen land like it treats stolen objects. Stolen land doesn't, it doesn't change. It doesn't, a stolen car, it's transformed now. It used to be the case I could sell it. From the moment it's stolen, I no longer have the power to sell it. Stolen land isn't like that. So in a sense, land can't be made stolen. Why? Well, one reason you might bring is a verse from not Omer, but from Parsha Bahar. V'ha'aretz lo timacher. When you buy a plot of land, especially in the land of Israel, you can't actually sell it. Not for all eternity, not litzmitut, right? You can't sell the land, in the translation that I copied and pasted from Sefaria, beyond reclaim. You can't sell it into perpetuity, because every 50 years the land goes back to its ancestral owners in biblical law. But God explains why. Ki li haaretz, because fundamentally the land belongs to me. Ki geirim v'toshavim atem imadi. You're just resident aliens with me. And it's a beautiful verse, because God is actually echoing words that were first uttered by Avraham, right? Avraham Avinu says to the children of Chet, when he wants to buy a plot of land, Dafka, in the land of Israel, to bury his wife, Sarah, he says, look, I need my own cemetery, because even though I live among you, I'm not quite the same as you. I am a resident alien among you. And God says to the Jewish people when they go into the land of Israel, don't think that now you're going to be sovereign, that's changed, because actually the land belongs to me. It doesn't belong to you. It's holy land. I allow you to treat it as if it's yours, right? So actually, land ownership in Jewish law is something of a legal fiction. We're allowed to treat the land ki'ilu as if it's ours and ours alone, and therefore certain rights come with it, right to exclusively farm it or whatever, but it's not really yours. It was never really yours. Now, for that reason, I'll come back to Kayla's question in a minute. For that reason, in the chat, for those who didn't see it, for that reason, because karka eina nigzelet, the sages say that this first case, where I come in and I pick Simon up and throw him out, well, what did I steal? I didn't move any of the items I didn't even touch the sukkah. So I can't have stolen that. How can you steal something without touching it? And I didn't steal the land, because karka eina nigzelet. So everything's hunky-dory. I mean, it's not very nice. It's bad behavior, but you can fulfill the mitzvah of sukkah that way. But look at the third case. I legally acquired all the material and I built it as a squatter on Simon's land. Well, by the very same reasoning, what did I steal? Not the raw materials, they were mine. And not the land, because karka eina nigzelet. So you actually are, bidi avad, right, ex post facto, you are actually allowed to make a bracha on a sukkah that's built on land that doesn't belong to the owners of the sukkah. And that's actually a practical halacha that we see a lot of the time. Like in Golders Green in London, I remember all these restaurants would build sukkot on the street. And I'm sure they didn't have permits. So they were building their sukkah on public land with no... I once heard that sometimes they get a letter through the door saying you must take these structures down within 7 days. and they're like, okay. But that's okay. I mean, you shouldn't act that way. You should always ask for permission from the owners of a land before you do something. And the rabbis are not saying that lechachila, you know, that from the ab initio, a person should go about building a sukkah this way. But if you do, it's kosher sukkah. Vicky says Simon's time in his sukkah was stolen. Yeah, that's right. You've done all sorts of horrible things to Simon. You have you might have done grievous bodily harm to Simon. You've certainly stolen his time. You've also hurt his feelings. You've done all sorts of bad things. But you haven't stolen his sukkah. And all we're interested in here is, does this count as a case of a stolen sukkah? And it doesn't. It counts as stolen time, counts as grievous bodily harm. This person should be punished. Reuben should be punished. But he did get the mitzvah of sukkah, which is astonishing, but it's true. The second case, I think I'll be able to answer Kayla's question in a minute based on the second case. So the second case is, I stole all the raw materials for my sukkah, In fact, Kayla, as she took the car, she noticed that in the trunk was one of those build your own sukkah kits. So she had fortuitously stolen all of the raw materials for a sukkah, but she builds it on her mipeset. Even though she's squatting at our house, she decides to go back and see her family for Sukkot. So she goes with my car and she builds her sukkah using my raw materials. It's kosher, and I'll tell you why it's kosher. Kayla would owe me money to compensate me for the stolen goods. But there is a rabbinic institution, because the rabbis were very keen to encourage repentance. Now, a penitent thief has to give back everything that he or she has stolen. So Kayla has to bring my car back. Kayla has to bring my bamboo thing back that I use for schach. Kayla has to bring back all the raw materials for my sukkah. However, the rabbis want Kayla to do teshuvah, and I do too, Kayla. And therefore, they made this special deal, and they said, look, if you've used the raw materials that you stole to build something, then from that moment on, we're not going to ask thieves to go to the trouble of demolishing their houses or demolishing what they've built with stolen raw goods. Instead, we'll say it's enough that they just give the victim of their theft the monetary value of what they stole. And therefore, from the moment that Kayla uses those stolen goods to build her sukkah, the legal status of stolen goods evaporates from the goods that she stole to build the sukkah, and it transfers onto a monetary number that she needs to give to me. But if that's the case, nothing here is stolen anymore. It's on her land, and it's her it's her raw material. Vicky says, how do you restore stolen time? Well, there is such a thing in Jewish law as when you have damaged somebody through various ways you can damage somebody. You can cause them loss of earnings or things like that because of the time that was spent being damaged by you, and the rabbis have a notion of compensation for that. But again, that's not the sukkah, that's Simon's time. Now Kayla asks, what happens if Reuven has neither the materials nor the land? So he steals from Simon's garage and he builds it on Simon's land. It would still be kosher because karka ein onigzelet, the land isn't stolen, and from the moment Reuven used the raw materials to build the sukkah, from the moment it's built, the raw materials are not considered stolen anymore either because of this rabbinic institution. Yes. Now Kayla asks, but what about stealing a lulav? Well, that's what I want to get onto. It's very, very difficult to steal a sukkah. Reuven has been trying, okay? Case 1, he tries to steal a sukkah. No, it's not stolen sukkah. Case 2, he tries to steal a sukkah. No, it's not stolen sukkah. Case 3, he tries to steal a stolen sukkah. It's not a stolen sukkah. But the sages say you can't steal a sukkah. So what case were they talking about? This bothers Rashi on page 31a of the Gemara. And he says, well, there are some sukkahs that are such that you could literally pick the sukkah up, move it somewhere else, put it down, and then go and sit in it. So you're not using the raw materials and reconfiguring them, but you're actually picking up an entire sukkah and moving it. For instance, those sukkot that you build on the back of a camel or on the back of a boat, those are portable sukkot, right? Rashi says that's a stolen sukkah. So if the car that Kayla stole was one of those Chabad sukkah-mobiles, she couldn't have her sukkot meals in that sukkah because that's a portable sukkah and that's stolen. So there is such a thing as a stolen sukkah, but it's quite rare. Whereas a stolen lulav is just any lulav used without the permission of its owner, right? A stolen lulav is something we understand. A stolen sukkah is where all this trouble comes. Okay. Any questions, any comments? Kayla says, if you steal baking ingredients, flour, eggs, sugar, baking soda, and bake cookies with them, are the cookies not stolen too? No, that's also, that I think, if I've understood Takana Hashavim correctly, this institution that the rabbis made to help penitent sinners, no, I think it's exactly the same. They don't expect you to kind of like, well, in this case, it'd be impossible, right, to reconstitute the original goods from the cake. No, it's enough if you pay back the original sum of money. And what's interesting there, I want to come back to this later, but actually, there are two things present in the cake that Kayla's described, right? You've stolen all the raw ingredients and made a cake. There are two categories of thing there. There's the raw ingredients, and then there's the skill. And Vicky's been talking about the time and the energy that's kind of mixed into the ingredients so as to allow for cakiness to come down into this world. Well, right, that's called Shevach HaKli. It's called the improvement that Kayla brought to the raw ingredients. That belongs to Kayla, right? Because that's your labor. And there's something very interesting in Jewish law. If you take some raw wood, right, just untreated wood, and it's yours, and you take it to a carpenter and you say, hey, please, would you make a chair for me? At the end of the day, you are no longer the sole owner of the chair, because Jewish law has this notion of a laborer mixing his labor or her labor with the raw materials. So the carpenter in this instance has mixed her skill with my wood to make a chair. When I pay her, I'm not just paying her for her time. I'm actually buying her out of her share in the chair. Okay. Uman kona b'shevach hakli. The artisan acquires a share in the raw material through the improvement that he or she renders to the raw material. That's actually going to be a principle we're going to come back to later on when we talk about Karl Marx. Okay. And just for the record, Kayla wants everybody to know that if anybody does want to steal baking ingredients from her and repay her in the form of cookies and cakes, is very welcome to do so at any time. Thanks, Kayla. I'll try and take you up on that at some point. Okay. Rav Alex is enthusiastic too. Okay. So here is a lot of Hebrew text. I'm going to replace it almost immediately with a lot of English text. But again, it's there on the PowerPoint. The PowerPoint's being uploaded to a folder, and Deborah kindly will give you access to it. So if you want to download these PowerPoints from this class and learn the sources inside, you'll have that ability. What I want to introduce you to now is a mashal. Okay, that midrashic form of a parable, an analogy, an allegory, a metaphor. And this is a classic instance of one because it plays a trick on you. And the trick it plays on you is a trick that Midrash loves to play on people. And it's a trick that I would love to teach people to pay attention to be aware of, to be ready to identify. Okay, but first things first. Rabbi Levi said, this is a midrash on our Parsha, which says you should take for yourself the 4 species, the lulav and etrog, and willow and myrtle. Rabbi Levi said, to what is one who takes a stolen lulav compared to? That's bad. Yeah, Rabbi Levi wasn't very good at English grammar, clearly, but that wasn't his fault. He was a Hebrew speaker, Aramaic. Anyway, it's compared to a thief who one time stole everything that a tax collector had on him. There was a tax collector walking by, There's more in the original text. This thief is a highwayman who sits at junctions in roads waiting for people to come. One day happens to be a tax collector is coming by, and the highwayman pounces on the tax collector and takes everything the tax collector has. Eventually, the thief was caught and brought to jail, and the tax collector hears that the thief is in jail. So the tax collector came to him in jail and said to him, "Return the money to me. And if you do," well, it's actually, this isn't my translation, I copied and pasted from Sefaria, so it's actually really not my fault. He doesn't say return the money to me, he says return what you stole from me, right? And he says, and if you do, you know what, I'll do you a favor. I'll be a positive character reference before the king. You're gonna have a trial, and he's gonna say, well, do you know anybody who'll be willing to be Melitz Yoshe, be willing to say like, be a character reference, willing to say, you know what, you're not such a bad guy after all. I'll do it for you. And I'm a tax collector of the king. King knows me, king respects me. That's going to be great. You just have to give me back what you owe me, and I'll do that. And the thief said, oh, I wish I could. But I've got nothing left. I took it all to Vegas, and it's all gone. Everything I stole. Except, by the way, for this saddle. This saddle that he was actually sitting on. I don't think it's a saddle. I looked at Jastrow, and I think it's a mat. But maybe, you know, saddles back then were more like mats that dual purpose. It's the, you know, the mat that he was sitting on in his jail cell. It's the one thing he had left, and it used to belong to the tax collector. So, okay, they make a deal. The tax collector retrieves his stolen mat, but the tax collector promises to be a positive character reference for the thief. So, the next day, the thief is actually brought to justice. He's brought to the court, and the king is the judge. He is the judge and the juror. He's the, you know, and the executioner. He's an all-powerful king. And the king asked him, is there anyone willing to defend him? And the thief says, oh, funny you should ask that, right? Your own tax collector said that he would be my positive reference, my character reference. The king says, oh, all right. They call upon the tax collector, and the tax collector comes in, and he says, I was out collecting money for you, Your Majesty. And this dirty rascal, this thief, took all of my things. And this mat, which was still in his possession until yesterday, is proof that it was him. So he reneges on his promise, the tax collector. He doesn't act as a positive character reference. If anything, he uses the mat as evidence that this guy really is the thief. And do you know what happens? All of the people present in court, so you have to imagine like a completely full public gallery, a chorus. They say, woe to the one whose defense attorney becomes his prosecutor. And then the Midrash does what it so often does. In the technical jargon, we talk about a mashal, which is this parable type thing that we've just read. And we talk about the nimshal, which means the lesson you're supposed to learn. It's the relationship between the analogy and the analog, the mashal and the nimshal, okay? Very often the Midrash will spell the nimshal out for you, okay? And here it does. It says, so too, someone who takes a lulav to gain merit, if the lulav was stolen, the lulav, cries out to Hashem saying, I'm stolen property. In fact, the Hebrew is much better. It says, it cries out, the lulav cries out before the Holy One, blessed be He. The Omer, and it says, Gazul ani, chamus ani, I am stolen, I am plundered. And all the angels in heaven, they say, woe to this one whose defense attorney becomes his prosecutor. Now, it's a cute midrash. The idea is you bring a lulav and an etrog, somehow to look good, so to speak, in front of God, to accrue merit to yourself. And if it's stolen, you do the opposite. That's what Rabbi Levi is saying. It's a simple message. But very often, when you have a mashal in a midrash, if you look carefully enough, you will see that there's a misfit between the mashal and the nimshal. So I'll give you a minute just to look at this text and to think about, can you see any ways in which the mashal, technically speaking, doesn't quite fit the nimshal? That the metaphor, the parable, doesn't quite fit the teaching at the end from the word so too. And it's not all that easy to see, so don't worry if you can't.
I'll give it a try.
Go on.
Okay. There's nothing, there's no defense here. The angel says, woe to the one whose defense attorney becomes his prosecutor. But the lulav is not defending. He's saying, I'm stolen property.
Okay, well, I think what you're right about pointing out in terms of the difference is there was no deal done. You know, in the mashal also there was no defense, really. The tax collector stood up pretending to be the defender and became a prosecutor. In the nimshal, there's no deal done. Although maybe you could say there is a deal done, because tacitly the entire reason that you bring your lulav is to accrue merit, right? So that was supposed to be your defense attorney, but instead it shouts out, I was stolen, I was plundered. You're not, however, you're not far away from what I think is a key discrepancy.
I would say the discrepancy is between the tax collector representing the stolen property and the stolen property, the lulav, speaks for itself.
Yeah, that's right. And that's deliberate. And we need to think about why that was done. It's a misfit. Let me explain for everybody else who may not have seen it. There's a sense in which the mashal has 5 characters. There's the king, there's the criminal, there's the victim of the crime. And I think this is actually partly what Shoshana was being sensitive to as well, which is that the number of characters is wrong. Like, where's this defense guy? Where's this guy that's supposed to stand up? You know, you've got the king, you've got the highwayman, you've got the king's official, you've got the official's mat. Right, so I'm using the phrase character here very loosely, because it's not like the mat is a character, but it's there in the mashal, the stolen item. And you've got the audience in the court. So in the nimshal, who's the king? Don't all jump in at once. To whom does the king correspond?
God.
God. And the highwayman corresponds to the lulav thief, right? Who is the king's official in the nimshal? Who's the victim of the theft? Well, he doesn't actually appear explicitly in the story. I mean, there must have been one, because there's no such thing as a theft if there's nobody that you stole from, but he doesn't appear in the way that he appears in the mashal. Instead, you've got the lulav, which is the mat, but the lulav does the speaking. Whereas in the mashal, the king's official does the speaking, not the lulav. Okay, and then finally, the audience in the court is the angels. So what do we make of that? Why would the Midrash do that to us? Because I want to suggest, in order to lead you in the direction that I'm thinking, and you can see if you agree or think something different along these lines. What is the Midrash trying to teach us? By, it's not really that it leaves out the victim, it somehow conflates, it merges into one character, the victim and the stolen good, by having the victim's voice, so to speak, or the object speak on behalf of the victim or something like that. It merges them together. What do you think the Midrash is trying to say through that? Vicky, you're the one who saw it.
Well, perhaps it's good enough that which is stolen is obvious. I don't know. I mean, there was a sort of a turnaround in the first part,
Yeah.
where you had somebody who was supposedly promising to try to get the thief off, and then turns around and points his finger at the thief. And the things that were stolen almost are, they've disappeared really. In the second part, you don't have anybody speaking for the stolen goods, but the stolen goods speak for themselves.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that means you don't need anybody to speak for stolen property, or if it's so obvious.
Well, let's work with that. It's so obvious. Something like the stolen good wears its stolen status on its sleeve somehow, right? Its
stolen sleeve.
On its stolen sleeve. It says I'm stolen. It declares for itself that I'm stolen. What else does this say to people? Is there some deeper message here about how we should
the deeper message that perhaps God sees through all of it. So,
right.
So in the end, you're going to pay. Right. It may not be in this life.
Good. So Vicky's taking from it. Look, you don't need the victim to stand up in court, because when God looks at the object, God sees its stolenness, right? Doesn't need the victim to come into court and say, hey, it's stolen. But I suppose that's the point about eternal justice, right? God will catch up with you in the end. But I think there's also a message about the here and now, about perhaps, I don't want to spoon feed people too much, but perhaps about ethical consumerism. Okay. Kayla.
Another angle of this, which actually had been the angle that I assumed was always the main thrust of the "don't steal a lulav" example, was that especially for a time period when a lulav and etrog was very expensive or difficult to get, having this rule in essence stopped people from facing the question of, what should I do? Should I steal, which I'm not allowed to do, or should I not fulfill the mitzvah of lulav and etrog, which I'm also not allowed to do, although a little bit different. So if it was okay to fulfill the mitzvah of lulav with a stolen lulav, then it would in a sense force people into stealing if it wasn't otherwise affordable or available to them. So this Midrash is very much focusing on sort of the philosophical or the which I think is beautiful and important and good, but it also, practically speaking, it sets up a hierarchy of not stealing is more important than fulfilling mitzvah.
Yes, I agree. I think that's very important, and I actually want to come back. I want to come back to that. Very often the sages would encourage people not to spend too much money on certain things, right? So the famous principle on Shabbat, that you should rather make your Shabbat like a weekday than rely upon handouts from others. Because, you should spend money on Shabbat to make it as nice as possible, but within reason. You have to be economically responsible. But the lulav and etrog are the quintessential mitzvot that we try to beautify. And in fact, we spend more money than we normally would on a bumpy lemon, right, over Sukkot. And many of the laws of Hidur Mitzvah, which is the notion of beautifying Jewish practice and Jewish ritual, they're taught in the context of the laws of lulav and etrog. So Kayla's absolutely right that there's a particular incentive to steal when it's lulav and etrog, because everyone's boasting about how beautiful theirs are, right? And we don't have that notion like we have on Shabbat. Oh, you should rather make your Shabbat like the week. And no, on the contrary, the rabbi's saying, it's only once a year after all. Go and splurge on a really nice etrog and lulav. Well, that's going to create a prima facie incentive to steal, and along come the rabbis and say, no, it's more important not to steal your lulav. It's going to be even counterproductive, right? It's going to be counterproductive. You go and steal your lulav thinking that you're doing something great, but the angels in heaven are saying, oh, woe unto that person, and they're trying to make it a disincentive. But I think this is something interesting about the festival of Sukkot, which is, as it's come down to us, it's a festival which is in a sense a little bit demeaning to landowners in terms of its practical legal definitions. You have to leave your house and build a sukkah, and if somebody builds on your land, tough luck, right? It's still a sukkah, and if somebody, but a lulav, right? An owner of a sukkah, unless it's a portable sukkah, it has very little protection, okay? But the owner of a lulav has a lot of protection, and if possible, you should make it as beautiful as possible. So it's like you have the most capitalistic of lulavs and etrogim, right? It's this dog-eat-dog market where everyone's going to try and buy the nicest one, and were it not for the disincentive of stealing, we'd all go out and steal one. So thank God the rabbi said don't steal one, because we want to have the nicest one possible, versus this kind of communistic, nobody owns any land anyway, so you can build your sukkah wherever you like, attitude towards land ownership. But still, I don't think we've got to the heart of the ethical message of this Midrash. And Kayla is right that in a kind of narrow perspective, there's a particular public policy issue that needs to be addressed. Please don't go and steal a lulav and etrog after we've gone on and on and on about how beautiful they're supposed to be. Yes, but it seems to me that the rabbis now, maybe even only after the fact, they want to use this as an opportunity to teach about theft in general. And they want to say, it comes back to Vicky's point, that God sees more in the object than the thief does. The thief just sees a lulav. God hears the victim's voice crying through the lulav, or God even hears the victim, God even hears the lulav crying. God doesn't make a distinction between the voice of the victim even and the voice of the lulav. Bruce made a nice point about taxes and lulavim, right? Why is it a tax collector? Yeah, it's almost like we're not supposed to have all that much sympathy with this guy to begin with. Like, tax collectors are not, if you want to have the most sympathetic character, you don't choose necessarily the king's tax collector. That's kind of interesting. And why is the lulav compared to that? Maybe that ties in with what Kayla was saying. For the poor, when a poor person looks at a rich man shaking a lulav, there might be a lot of resentment, because everyone's going on about how you're supposed to have a beautiful lulav, you're supposed to have a beautiful etrog, and you know how much they cost. It's ridiculous. And maybe the sort of resentment you have towards, you almost feel like when you hear the beginning of the story, you hear there's a highwayman and you think, oh, that's not very nice. And then you hear it's a tax collector and you go, oh, go on, highwayman, get him for everything he's worth, right? Your sympathy is kind of with the highwayman when it's versus a tax collector. Well, that might also be on purpose. It might be like, you know what? We sympathize. It's not nice to be sitting in shul and these people all gloating about, oh, look at my lulav and it's in its golden, look at my etrog in its golden etrog container, and look at, basically look at how wealthy I am. It's not nice for the poorer people in the shul to be seeing that. And maybe you'd have some sympathy with them, like the thief who goes and steals from a tax collector. But even so, once the lulav's stolen, it shouts before God, I'm stolen, gazul ani, chamus ani, I'm plundered. And I want to suggest the following. I want to go a bit further than Vicky. It's not just about eternal justice. Imagine the sensitivity you'd have to walk into a cheap clothing store and, so to speak, hear the voices of the slave labor that made the clothes, just in the item of clothing. saying I was made unfairly. This isn't okay. I was reading recently about solar panels. I can't remember which country, but many of them are made by Uyghur slave labor in China. Solar panels. So, what type of sensitive ear hears when they're buying solar panels the protest of the Uyghur? The Uyghur doesn't have to be there. The voice is there in the item. There's this notion, you really see it in Hegel, in the tradition of Western philosophy, that you can't all too easily make a distinction between an item and its owner, because the identity of the owner seeps into the item. So when a thief breaks into somebody's house and sees the family heirloom, the silver candlesticks that were smuggled through the Warsaw Ghetto and were handed down from mother to daughter to mother to daughter, the thief sees silver. But a sensitive person is supposed to see, so to speak, or hear in the silver the voices of those generations of women, and that story of mother to daughter, and the Mesiras Nefesh, the sacrifice of passing it on. It's all there in the item itself. This actually goes back to what we were speaking about in last week about Kedoshim TU, about holiness. Things become holy when you look at them in the right way. And perhaps there's a right way of looking at objects. And to look at an object properly is not to be able to distinguish the object from the human story that's bound up with the object. And the rabbis dramatize that point by giving you a mashal and a nimshal. And in the mashal, you have somebody who owns something and the thing that was owned. That's the tax collector and the mat. But in the nimshal, you just have a lulav and it speaks, which is a very kind of vivid way of dramatizing the way in which objects and their owners are bound up one in the other. Okay, that's what I want to say about the Midrash. And if there's, I'm going to take you to Karl Marx in a second. But if there's anything that I'd really like to be the take-home point of the Midrash, is now anytime you see a mashal and then you see a nimshal, see whether they really fit. And if they don't fit, try and come up with some theories as to why don't they fit, because it's very often that's where the heavy weight of the Midrash is. The real thing that's being said. It's not merely, oh, don't steal a lulav, that's counterproductive. There's also a point being made here about the nature of objects and their relationship to their owners and their relationship to the human story. And therefore the crime of theft is more than just taking possession of an object. It's almost the silencing of a voice that's in that object, a desecration, so to speak, of that object. And that's not being said by the Midrash explicitly. That's being said by the Midrash in the misfit between mashal and nimshal. And in my experience, I found that's often where the heavy weight of the Midrash is. It's in the discord between a mashal and a nimshal. Okay, I just want to say something briefly about Karl Marx. Karl Marx was made fun of because he was saying, get rid of property, right? In the end of days, there'll be no property. In the communist utopia, there'll be no private property. And then people would say, what? I can't even have my own toothbrush? That's ridiculous and unhygienic. I want my own toothbrush. I don't want to share my toothbrush with the commune. And Marx and Engels, they address this in the Communist Manifesto. This is a quote from the Communist Manifesto. So the distinguishing feature of communism is not the abolition of property generally, it's the abolition of bourgeois property. And what they mean by that is that we need to distinguish between two types of property. What he calls personal property, property that really is yours, and we'll see later on he really means it's property that your identity is bound up with, because Marx was in some respects a student of Hegel, and the means of production. The means of production are the stuff that all humans need to live, and if anybody was to monopolize them, we'd all die, like the land. right? How can you own land? Because if land ownership was possible, then somebody could buy up all the land. Where would anybody else live? Oxygen, water, right? That's bourgeois property. That's what he had a problem with. The distinction is you can own a lulav, but you can't own land, which is very much the message we're seeing through the Midrashim about the sukkah and the lulav, and the difference between the sukkah and the lulav. You can own property, and the distinction goes further in Jewish property law, by the way. A distinction between metaltalin and karka. Metaltalin are movable objects, and karka is the land. There's a sense in which, and you can see this right throughout Baba Batra, and I do have a piece where I work on this, where according to the majority of the medieval commentators on the Talmud, land ownership is always something of a fiction. It comes back to this, Kili haaretz, the land really belongs to God. And the rituals around land ownership and taking ownership are all kind of symbolistic, ritualistic, because it's not real, it's fiction. But as soon as you mix your labor with that piece of wood, gosh, that wood's yours. Because if you do really own something, it's your labor. And the things that you can actually mix your labor with, not land, although John Locke thought if you mix your labor with a piece of land, the land becomes yours. No, land isn't ownable. Land belongs to everybody, or in the Jewish view, land belongs to God. But anything that's movable really becomes yours as soon as you mix your labor with it. Now, Karl Marx, just take you to the last quote because it's really very beautiful. Oh, I have to end my class because something, I'll have to pass up. That's right, Kayla's saying this only really applies to the land of Israel in Jewish law. Well, there's a beautiful quote that you can see on the last slide of the, on the last slide of the PowerPoint, which says that in a perfect communist society, people would get to see the things that they made, and when they part with them in like exchange, everybody would honor the image of other people in the objects that they made for one another. And each object would be like a mirror to the soul of its maker and a mirror to the soul of the person made. And in that way, we'd do a great deal of justice to one another. And I think that even though Jewish law and communism are quite far apart from one another in a lot of ways, these midrashim that treat, especially not Rabbi Eliezer, but the sages, that treat the lulav and the sukkah differently, are doing so because of a deeper understanding of a difference between land ownership and the ownership of other things. And it's not a depreciation of ownership. On the contrary, the objects that are really yours, those metaltalin, the lulav and etrog, they're yours in a very, very profound way. They're an expression of who and what you are. But the land isn't.